Although Magnus fainted, the phone had already connected to the colleague's number. Joe quickly hung up the call and dialed the emergency center, explaining the situation. After that, Joe hurriedly packed up and left with Alice. She couldn't shake the feeling that the command center was against her, the most likely reason being to cover up the fact that she saw a female corpse in space. Otherwise, why would they give her psychiatric medication? The previously received magnetic tape recording was even stranger, containing recordings of Joe's conversations between the space station and the command center, but Joe remembered very clearly that communication with the space station was clearly interrupted during that time. In order to uncover the truth, Joe returned to the command center again. She wanted to see if there were any communication records in the archives from that time. However, her access was too low, and she couldn't access anything. The only thing she could open was the recording of the dual quantum experiment before the space station collision accident. Joe had a sudden idea and immediately ran to the lab to pull out the experimental equipment. Regardless of whether the experiment was related to the space station accident, she decided to take the equipment away for further study before making any conclusions. The next crucial step was to escape the city with Alice. As they passed by a restaurant, they sat down to eat. Joe was curious why Alice liked to hide in closets. In Joe's memory, Alice had never had this habit. Alice's response made her face pale. She said there was a woman who often said strange things, making her feel scared, so she hid. Joe believed this was Alice's hallucination. To help Alice face her fear, she suggested Alice draw the woman. Then she turned and dialed a number on a public phone. The person who sent the recording tape officially sent it. Joe originally planned to visit, but the person on the other end hung up without hesitation. She was curious and looked up the sender's information. Online information showed that the person had served 6 months in prison for forging recordings. Joe felt a wave of dizziness. She confirmed that the contents of the tape were not forged because she had indeed said those things on the space station. After calming down, Joe called Magnus to inquire about his condition, but at that moment, Alice approached her holding the portrait she had just drawn. Joe recognized the person in the drawing as the astronaut's corpse she had seen in space. She looked at Alice in disbelief. She had never mentioned this incident to Alice before. The succession of bizarre events prompted Joe to investigate them all thoroughly. She first went to the sender's house of the tape, where a well-dressed old lady came out after Joe explained her purpose. It was her brother who had hung up the phone earlier. They were amateur astronomers who once intercepted a communication record from the space station using an old monitoring device. However, the official stance was that they had never received such communication. So, the siblings began recording these communications, which led to them being sued by the command center and imprisoned. Recently, after hearing about Joe's sighting of the astronaut's corpse in space, which Irina vehemently denied, they sent her the tape. It was very similar to the communications they intercepted, clearly existing, yet the command center refused to acknowledge it. The brother was worried about causing unnecessary trouble again, but the old lady felt that Joe should be helped to understand the truth. The communication records from the space station on the tape had not even been received by the command center, but the old lady had recorded them using an old-fashioned monitoring device. Alice saw a familiar face in the photo on the table. It was Henry from his youth. It turned out that Henry had been here before. He had tried to get back the recording of the Apollo program. Joe remembered an accident that had occurred during that space program, and Henry was the only survivor, after which he seemed to have changed completely. The old lady suddenly silenced him. It turned out that the siblings had been under surveillance from the space center all along. She told Joe that if he wanted to know the truth, he should accompany her on a trip to the sea. She said that the universe often experiences inexplicable phenomena. 6 astronauts once saw a purple light ball on the space station, which even made it into the newspapers. As the small cargo ship slowly started up, she said they needed to sail forward for 8 nautical miles, where there was a boundary between 2 spaces, where they could capture some sounds that are usually unheard of. She then took out a box of tapes, inside of which was the communication record of a female astronaut before she encountered an accident in 1967. After a crackling sound of electric current, the voice of a woman was heard, and she had checked that the only female astronaut who took off that day was Irina, but she safely returned to Earth afterward. So, who was the dead woman? Seeing Joe lost in thought, she started playing another tape, and to Joe's horror, it was the voice of the deceased commander. Joe's face changed drastically. She felt that this was fabricated, as she had seen the other person die with her own eyes on the space station. The old lady's expression turned stern as she spoke. She said that more than 500 people have been to space for exploration, and many of them were later diagnosed with mental illness. However, these were all top talents who underwent rigorous screening and training. How could they easily suffer mental breakdowns? It's obvious that someone is covering up some truth, and there's definitely some secret in space that they don't want the public to know. Joe felt overwhelmed by the amount of information and needed to go back and digest it. Before parting ways, the old lady gave her several tapes. Joe wanted to refuse, but she was insisted upon. Meanwhile, Henry was unaware that his experimental equipment had been stolen. Irina called him to tell him she had just read an article stating that a Nobel laureate in physics gave a speech emphasizing that the key point of quantum mechanics is the entanglement of two or more particles, where a change in one particle affects the state of another. Henry pondered over it. When he returned to the lab in a better mood, he found his equipment missing, and he trembled with excitement. He immediately called Irina, hoping she could help him. Wanting to calm down, Henry went to the bathroom, but he heard his own voice making a phone call. It turned out to be another Henry from a parallel universe talking on the phone. Henry seemed unfazed by this and wrote a message on the mirror using steam, which the other Henry actually saw. Despite his grim expression, he hung up the phone. On the other side, Henry found Joe's colleague and decided to join him in searching for Joe, suspecting she might have taken the experimental equipment. Since his experiment had already been shelved by the command center, no one cared about the theft. Suddenly, Henry rolled his eyes and found his pants soaked with urine. However, he firmly stated that he must accompany them to find Joe. After receiving a positive response, Henry quickly walked into the bathroom, his face full of anger, and unexpectedly greeted his reflection in the mirror. When Henry turned around again, the other Henry had already appeared in the mirror. Henry asked if he had stopped taking his medication, to which the other nodded, expressing a desire for revenge because Henry had sent the experimental equipment to the space station, resulting in a mess. The Henry in the mirror angrily stated, "I will definitely come to your world to settle the score," but Henry retorted, "You can't do that," to which the Henry in the mirror replied, "I can make you piss your pants." Meanwhile, Joe was taking Alice to a vacation cabin in the woods, her mind filled with too many questions. She asked Alice to play the tapes again, and surprisingly, the voices on the tapes were much clearer than before. Joe brought the recorder close to the experimental equipment, and to her amazement, there was no noise at all from the tape. Joe finally realized the peculiar nature of the experimental equipment. As they approached a fork in the road, Joe suddenly stopped the car, furrowing her brow because she remembered there wasn't supposed to be a fork in the road here. Alice told her to go left, and after passing a frozen lake, they finally arrived at the vacation cabin. Joe took out a box of tapes containing clear recordings of her communications with her daughter before the accident. When Joe heard Alice calling her, she immediately turned off the recorder. It turned out Alice had also heard the contents of the recordings, but she suddenly told Joe that the little girl in the recordings wasn't her because she couldn't speak Dutch, and she never called Joe Mom.